The safety clicked, and Ranger's ears snapped forward, every muscle in his 85-pound frame locking. Megan Hart caught cheap cologne over river fog and diesel, and a man's voice, young, amused, mean, said, "Come on, Doc, don't make this weird." Rain drifted sideways off the Columbia, turning Pier 7 into a slick gray sheet. Across the street, a diner's neon crab sign buzzed in the afternoon gloom, and Veterans Day banners snapped on the light poles, bright stripes at 40 de Croisière. Megan had brought Ranger here for 10 minutes of air between surgeries, a quick walk before heading back to her small rescue clinic. Megan's clinic sat 3 miles inland in a converted bait shop with a porch light that never stopped flickering, a place that smelled of bleach, wet fur, and the clam chowder the diner owner dropped off when she worked late. She'd moved here after vet school because small towns still believed in second chances, or at least she wanted to. Ranger was the reason she kept that belief. He'd come to her from a search and rescue unit after a warehouse collapse, brave, battered, and newly afraid of sudden metal sounds. She'd stitched his paw pads, eased his nightmares, and taught him that hands could heal instead of hurt. In return, he followed her like a shadow with a heartbeat, steadying her when bills stacked up and lonely evenings pressed in. On good days, he chased gulls along docks. On bad ones, he lay under her desk, listening for danger, willing to stay calm. Colt Crane stepped into their path like he owned the concrete. His camel coat was too clean for a dock. His hair was too slick for weather. 2 thick-necked men hung back near crab pots, pretending not to watch. Colt smiled as if Megan had been waiting for him. "Dr. Hart, you keep ignoring my calls." "I'm working," Megan said. She tried to sidestep. Colt shifted with her, tightening the lane between fence and seawall. "You always say no first," he replied. "It's cute." "Move," Megan said, and felt the leash bite into her palm. Ranger didn't bark. He rumbled low, steady, stepping forward to place his body between Colt and Megan. Colt's gaze slid to the dog. "That thing bite?" "He protects," Megan said. Colt leaned in anyway, whiskey and mint gum. His hand clamped around her sleeve. Pain flashed up her arm. "Let go," Megan said. Colt glanced at the few people nearby, folks who didn't want trouble, and his grin sharpened. "You're embarrassing yourself." Ranger's lips lifted, teeth showing. Colt's face twisted with offended rage, like the dog had insulted his bloodline. "Get this mud off me," he snapped and drew his leg back. The kick hit Ranger's ribs with a dull thud. Ranger skidded, a rough cough tearing out of him as air left his lungs. Megan dropped to her knees, hands on his side, whispering, "Breathe, buddy, breathe." Ranger's eyes stayed on Colt. He shook once, then forced himself upright. "That's enough." The words came from behind them, low and flat. A man rose from an iron bench by the seawall, as if he'd been part of it. Early 30s, broad shoulders under a plain charcoal jacket, dark hair cut short. His eyes were storm gray and too alert, sweeping Colt's hands, the 2 bodyguards, the open spaces. He crossed the distance with a controlled stride that didn't slip on wet concrete. Colt scoffed. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who saw you kick a dog," the man said, hands open. "Let her go." Colt tightened his grip on Megan's sleeve. "This is Crane business." "I don't care," the man answered. Colt's smile went ugly. His right hand dipped inside his coat and came out with a pistol, matte black, compact. A gasp went through the air. Megan's mouth went dry. Colt leveled the gun at the man's chest, wrist trembling. "Walk." The man tilted his head, studying Colt's grip like a mechanic inspecting a bad bolt. "Your finger's on the trigger," he said. "Take it off." Colt blinked. "What?" "Says take it off," the man repeated, and stepped forward. Ranger pressed against Megan's knee, breath harsh but steady, ready to launch even injured. Colt's trigger finger tightened. The man moved first. A sharp slap shoved the barrel wide. His other hand wrapped Colt's wrist. There was a twist, fast, precise, and the pistol flew free, clattering across the pier and skidding into a puddle. Colt made a strangled sound as his wrist buckled. The man drove him down with leverage, pinning him on his shoulder with a knee. One bodyguard surged. The man looked up once, calm, certain. The bodyguard stopped, hands lifting. Sirens wailed. A police cruiser slid in at the pier entrance. Deputy Rourke stepped out, rain dripping from his hat brim. A younger officer followed, eyes wide. "Get off him!" Rourke shouted. The man rose immediately, backing away with open hands. "Weapons on the ground," he said. "He assaulted her. He kicked the dog." Rourke's eyes snapped to Colt, and something softened in his face. Colt pushed up, cradling his wrist, then pointed at the stranger. "He attacked me," Colt said. "He's dangerous." "That's not what happened," Megan said, standing, rain running down her cheeks. "He grabbed me. He pulled a gun." Rourke didn't look at her. "Mr. Crane," he said, voice suddenly respectful. "Are you hurt?" Colt's mouth curled. "Arrest him." The younger officer hesitated, staring at the pistol half submerged in the puddle, at Megan's bruising sleeve, at Ranger's shallow breaths. Rourke stepped close to the stranger and lowered his voice. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." The stranger's jaw flexed. "You're letting him?" "You don't understand how this town works," Rourke cut in. "That's Silas Crane's son." The name landed like a door slamming. Megan felt Ranger's body tighten, as if he sensed the fear she refused to show. The stranger looked past Rourke to Colt, then to Megan, and something in his eyes settled into decision. He nodded once. "I understand perfectly." He turned, crouched beside Ranger, and his hands became gentle, practiced. "Can he breathe?" he asked. "Yes," Megan whispered, "but he's hurting." "We'll get him warm," the man said. He lifted Ranger carefully, as if the dog mattered the way a teammate would. Ranger's head sagged for a second. Then he pressed his muzzle against the man's shoulder, trusting. Megan followed toward her battered Subaru near the fence. Behind her, Colt's voice carried, quiet and poisonous. "You just made an enemy, Doc." Megan opened the passenger door and guided Ranger inside. Then she looked up at the man who'd stepped between them and a gun. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, eyes scanning the pier. "Ethan," he said. A black SUV eased into the lot without headlights and stopped, idling. Its tinted window didn't show a face, but Megan felt the weight of attention. Ethan's gaze flicked to the SUV, then back to Megan. "Drive," he said softly. "And don't go home the way you usually do." Megan started the engine. Ranger let out one low, stubborn huff and lifted his head, ears forward, as if marking the sound of that idling SUV forever. The porch light flickered twice, then went dead, and Ranger's nails skittered on the linoleum as he tried to stand before Megan could stop him. Rain snapped against the windows in hard beads, and behind the building, a loose piece of metal clanged once. Sharp, hollow, wrong. Ethan Brooks didn't flinch, but his head turned toward the sound the way a compass finds north. They didn't drive the familiar route from Pier 7. Megan looped through streets that smelled like wet cedar and diesel, passing a closed diner with a neon crab sign buzzing in the fog and a high school stadium where the field lights were finally dark. Ethan sat rigid in the passenger seat, eyes sweeping mirrors and corners, counting exits without meaning to. Every few blocks, Megan checked the rearview mirror. A black SUV drifted behind them, coasting without headlights, never close enough to seem like a threat. She made 2 sudden right turns, looped past a gas station, then doubled back along the waterfront. And finally the SUV slid away into the rain like it had been swallowed. Her clinic sat above the harbor in a converted bait shop, with cedar shingles blackened by Pacific weather. A hand-painted sign, Heart Animal Rescue, hung from chains that squeaked in the wind. Inside, warmth and antiseptic hit Megan's face. The reception desk was cluttered with donation jars, lost pet flyers, and a stack of unpaid invoices that she kept, turned face down. Ranger, 85 pounds of stubborn, black and tan, tried to hop down from the back seat on his own. Megan pressed a hand to his chest. "No hero stuff," she whispered. Ethan lifted him. Megan snapped into work because work didn't shake. She washed her hands, clipped fur over Ranger's ribs, and ran gentle fingers along the bruised area. His breath was shallow but steady. Temperature 101, 8 degrees still, normal. Relief hit like a wave and left her legs weak. She injected pain medication, wrapped his chest with a wide bandage, and settled him on a thick blanket in the recovery kennel. Ranger's eyes stayed on her the whole time, fierce and embarrassed, as if pain were a moral failure. Ethan didn't sit. He hovered at the front window, blinds angled so he could see the street without being seen. His reflection floated in the glass. Broad shoulders, close-cropped hair, stillness that felt coiled. "You said his name," he murmured. Silas Crane, Megan said, peeling off gloves. He owns the harbor contracts, cold storage, trucking routes, the council's patience. People here learn to breathe around him. She swallowed. And Colt is his son. Ethan's jaw flexed. The deputy? He said. He already chose a side. He always will, Megan replied. She forced herself to look at Ethan. You shouldn't be here. You can leave. Tonight, before this becomes a thing that follows you. Ethan stared toward the door like he could see the shape of coming trouble through wood. I am here, he said, like a decision. Then he nodded at the lock. Your deadbolt's loose. It works, Megan said automatically. Ethan crossed the room, knelt, and pushed once. The strike plate shifted in the frame. It works for honest people, he said, not for professionals. He asked for a toolbox and started reinforcing the door with longer screws, tightening hinges, adding a simple latch he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket. The sounds, metal to wood, the soft rasp of a screwdriver, felt strangely domestic, like fixing a porch step. Megan brewed coffee because it gave her hands a job. The percolator burbled, filling the clinic. Ranger, groggy but awake, watched Ethan work. After a long minute, the shepherd's tail thumped once against the blanket. Ethan glanced over, surprised, and the hard lines of his face eased by a fraction. A car engine purred outside, smooth, expensive, wrong for this hill road. Ethan went still. Ranger's ears rose. Through the blinds, Megan saw a black sedan parked perfectly at the curb. Two men stepped out first, coats dark, posture trained, scanning the street with quiet precision. Then the rear door opened and Silas Crane emerged under an umbrella held for him like a crown. Ethan opened the door before Silas could knock and filled the frame. We're closed, he said. Silas's smile belonged on a campaign poster. Mr. Brooks, he said, as if they'd been introduced properly. I apologize for my son's behavior. Colt has impulses. His eyes slid past Ethan. Dr. Hart. Megan stepped into the hallway anyway, heart hammering. Leave, she said. Silas's gaze measured her like inventory, then warmed. You do good work, he said, voice smooth as aged whiskey. This town needs people like you. I'd hate for you to feel unsafe. He lifted a thick envelope, crisp edges, no rain spots. Compensation, for the dog. For your inconvenience, for peace. Ethan's laugh was low and humorless. You think you can buy peace with paper? I can buy outcomes, Silas replied, and the warmth drained from his eyes. Service deserves respect. Take the money. Take a vacation. Let this be the end. He stepped closer, rain running off the umbrella's edge in a steady curtain. If it isn't, he continued softly, accidents happen, brake lines fail, electrical fires start, animals bolt into traffic, a clinic made of old wood and good intentions can burn fast. His gaze flicked down the hallway toward Ranger. It would be a tragedy. From the shadows of the treatment room, Ranger released a low, steady growl, less threat than truth. Ethan leaned forward until Silas had to lift his chin to keep eye contact. If you or your son come near her again, Ethan said, quiet as a blade, I won't disarm anyone. I will end it. Silas held the stare, then slid the envelope back into his coat with deliberate care. A soldier with a cause, he murmured, noble, foolish. He nodded once, like a man concluding a deal. Enjoy the rain, Mr. Brooks. It lasts a long time here. He turned and walked back to the sedan. His men moved with him like shadows. The car rolled away without hurry, taillights fading into mist. Ethan shut the door and locked it. Then he moved through the clinic methodically, a metal filing cabinet wedged against the back door, a chair braced under a handle, a scatter of expired glass vials beneath the side window, like crunchy gravel. He left the lights off. Sleep upstairs, he told Megan. If you hear anything, don't come down. Megan wanted to argue. Instead, she knelt beside Ranger's kennel and rested her forehead against the metal bars. Hold the line, she whispered, fingers sliding through his fur. Ranger's eyes opened a slit and his tail thumped once. Stubborn reassurance. At 2:17 a.m., a thin metallic rasp scratched at the back door lock, and Ethan's eyes opened in the dark. Glass crunched under a boot in the dark, and the 85-pound ranger's growl rose from his bruised ribs like thunder trying to stay quiet. Ethan was already moving, barefoot on linoleum, shoulders angled toward the back hallway, while the clinic held its smells of bleach, wet fur, and bitter coffee gone stale. The rear lock clicked once, then again, the tiny sound of a pick searching for purchase. Ethan didn't touch a light switch. He'd walked the room twice after Silas Crane left, memorizing every edge. The exam table, the rolling stool, the narrow gap beside the sink, the spot where old floorboards squeaked. He slid behind stainless steel, slowed his breathing until it matched the rain on the windows, and listened. Ranger stood in the recovery kennel with a wide bandage around his chest, head lifted, ears forward, shaking with effort but refusing to lie down. A hard shoulder hit the back door. The filing cabinet Ethan had wedged there scraped but held. Another thud, heavier, meant to splinter wood. Then a pause, too calm, followed by glass shattering at the side window. Cold air poured in with cheap tobacco and damp wool. Shadows slipped through the opening with practiced quiet, not kids, not drunk dock workers. One carried a short baton. Another swept a flashlight low, beam cutting across donation jars and lost pet flyers taped to the wall. Their breathing was controlled, their boots wrapped in tape to soften sound. Upstairs, Megan woke to Ranger's growl and the crack of glass. Her heart slammed so hard it made her throat ache. She slid out of bed, grabbed the aluminum baseball bat from beside her closet, and padded to the top of the stairs. She hated that she owned the bat. She hated more that it made her feel safer. Below, the clinic was nearly black, lit only by the green exit sign and a thin stripe of streetlight leaking through blinds. She could see vague shapes moving, and she could hear rain against glass, steady and close. The first intruder stepped forward, and his boot found the scatter of expired glass vials Ethan had laid under the window. Crunch. The man froze, flashlight beam wobbling. Ethan erupted from behind the exam table. One step, then impact. His palm drove up under the man's chin, snapping his head back. The flashlight spun a white circle across the ceiling and died. Before the body hit the floor, Ethan pivoted and caught the second attacker's baton swing on his forearm, then drove an elbow into the man's solar plexus. Air whooshed out. The baton clattered. Ethan didn't chase noise, then he ended it. A taller shadow barked, voice tight with control, and a lead pipe came whistling through the dark. Ethan ducked. The pipe slammed into a cabinet, metal shrieking. Ethan grabbed the pipe hand, twisted, and drove the man into a shelving unit. Stainless trays and bandage boxes crashed, a brief metallic storm. In the chaos, Ranger pushed out of the kennel. His chest bandage tugged with every breath, but he planted himself at the base of the stairs, body broad, shoulders squared, blocking the way up like a living gate. One intruder saw the dog and chose cruelty. He swung a boot toward Ranger's ribs. Ranger yelped, pain flashing across his face, but he stayed where he was, absorbing the kick like a shield. Megan's hands tightened on the bat until her knuckles burned. She took one step down, then stopped. Ethan had told her to stay put. She forced herself to obey, because if she ran down now, she would become another target, another lever for Silas Crane to pull. Outside, a foghorn moaned from the harbor, and a truck hissed past on wet asphalt. But inside the clinic, every sound belonged to strangers with no right to be. The tall leader recovered, blood streaking his forehead. He lifted 2 fingers in a signal. A fourth man dropped through the window with a knife and a quiet confidence that felt worse than noise. Broad shoulders, shaved head, a jagged scar near his jaw. The leader said his name like a warning, Vargas. Vargas's gaze slid over Ethan, then fixed on Ranger, then flicked upward toward the stairs. Ranger's growl deepened, as if the dog could smell intent. Vargas smiled. "Boss said leave the girl alive," he murmured, but he didn't say anything about the dog. Ethan stepped into the exit sign's green glow so Vargas could see him clearly. Water dripped from Ethan's hair. His face was blank, calm, in a way that made the room colder. "You're done," he said. Vargas lifted the knife. "You embarrassed the wrong family." Ethan moved first, not a rush, a decision. He slid left, forcing Vargas to turn, then snapped a kick to the outside of Vargas's knee to steal balance. Vargas slashed toward Ethan's ribs. Ethan caught the wrist, turned it inward, and Vargas's shoulder popped with a wet crack. Vargas screamed. Ethan slammed him forward onto the reception desk, cheek against laminate, and pressed his forearm across Vargas's throat, just enough to silence, not enough to kill. Ranger surged one step closer, teeth bared, a warning without contact. "Tell Silas Crane," Ethan said close to Vargas's ear, voice low and steady. "He sent wolves and forgot to check if there was a shepherd home. Tell him if he sends anyone again, they won't walk out." Vargas's eyes watered. He nodded hard. Ethan released him. Vargas collapsed, coughing, clutching his shoulder. The remaining men hesitated, suddenly aware that darkness belonged to Ethan, and that the dog at the stairs was still standing. Ethan pointed toward the broken window. "Take your people," he said. "Go!" They did, dragging the unconscious man, limping over glass, vanishing into rain. Silence rushed in, ringing in Megan's ears. Ethan listened for retreating engines, then turned to Ranger. He knelt, hands gentle, checking the bandage, pressing carefully along bruised ribs. Ranger's tail thumped once, stubborn, and he licked Ethan's fingers like a soldier acknowledging a commander. Megan finally came down the stairs, bat lowered, but not dropped. Her voice shook anyway. "Ranger, I'm so sorry." Dastum, Ranger leaned his head into her thigh, warm and heavy, forgiveness in the weight. Ethan crossed to the landline behind the desk, the phone Megan mostly used for older clients who didn't trust smartphones. His fingers hovered, then dialed from memory. It rang twice. A crisp voice answered. "This line is for emergencies." Ethan exhaled, the sound of a decade loosening. "It's an emergency, Marcus," he said. "Silas Crane just sent a team to my door. I need organized crime, and I need it fast." Megan watched him, realizing the fight had shifted. This wasn't just a town problem anymore. When Ethan hung up, he met her eyes over the reception desk, rainlight striping his face. "If we want this to end," he said softly, "we need proof that lives outside Silas Crane's reach." Outside, the storm kept falling, patient as a countdown at last. A gull shrieked over the stacks, and a spotlight swept the rain-slick concrete, turning the harbor mist into a moving wall, and Ranger stopped dead, one paw lifted, because the air tasted wrong. Diesel and river salt, yes, but also a hot, sour animal musk that didn't belong on a November dock. Ethan left the borrowed pickup 2 blocks away behind a bait shop and walked in with Ranger tight to his left knee. Midnight sat at 38 degrees, cold enough to sting lungs. He wore a black hoodie under a faded flannel, cargo pants, and soft-soled boots. Nothing that screamed military, but everything that let him disappear. Ranger's chest was wrapped from Colt Crane's kick, and the white bandage around his head made him look like a veteran who'd refused to quit. Ethan kept 2 fingers hooked in the harness strap, feeling the dog's ribcage rise and fall, counting it like a metronome. The port was a grid of metal and puddles, and every reflection looked like a doorway to trouble. He didn't look at the cranes. He looked at cameras, shadows, and exits. 3 miles inland, Megan sat on the clinic stairs with the lights off and the baseball bat across her knees. Diner coffee cooled in her mug. Gauze, antiseptic, and trauma shears lay beside her, as if preparation could keep fear from multiplying. Ranger's empty kennel made the room feel wrong-sized. She stared at the reinforced front door and tried to imagine tomorrow like it still belonged to her, but every creak in the building sounded like a hand testing a lock. Pier 7's gate was chain link and keypad. Beyond it, cranes hunched and container stacks rose like dark cliffs, their sides slick with rain. A sign read, "Authorized personnel only." Ethan waited in the shadow of a maintenance shed until 2 guards wandered past, collars up, hands in pockets, laughing at a phone. When their footsteps faded, he slipped through a gap where the fence met a warped post, then melted between container rows, stepping only when the wind covered his sound, and Ranger's paws made no noise at all. Ranger's first warning wasn't a bark. It was a full-body stiffening when a forklift rounded a corner, and its reverse beeper echoed off steel. Ranger flinched, then forced himself still, swallowing the instinct to bolt. Ethan's palm settled on his shoulder, steady pressure, steady breath. And Ranger's eyes flicked to him like he was asking permission to be brave. Then the wind shifted, and the smell returned. Musk, sawdust, urine, not drugs, not guns, something alive. Ranger pulled left, nose low, toward a stack stamped crane shipping, and Ethan followed because in combat, you trust the scout. The padlock was new and heavy. Ethan pressed flat to the container's cold ribbing and worked it by touch. Click. The shackle released. He opened the door an inch, and a sound drifted out that made his stomach drop. A thin, distressed cry, like a bird calling for a sky it couldn't reach. He widened the gap and slid a low red beam across cages stacked to the ceiling. Eyes flashed back at him. A hyacinth macaw trembled, feathers dulled with fear. In another crate, a pangolin was curled into an armored ball, its tail tucked tight as if it could disappear inside itself. There were tags on the cages with fake shipping codes, but the smell told the truth. Ranger made a sound in his throat, half whine, half anger, and Ethan felt something in him go cold and sharp. This wasn't just theft. This was cruelty packed into steel. He shut the door gently, like the animals could hear the kindness, and whispered, "Hold on," even though he knew they couldn't understand the words. A portable office trailer squatted 50 yards away, lit by a fluorescent buzz. Ethan crossed puddles using container rows as cover. The trailer window showed a desk, a laptop, a wall map, and a cheap space heater, humming. No one inside. He climbed the downspout, pried a skylight loose, and dropped 6 feet into stale air that smelled of cologne and printer ink. The laptop was already on, a login saved, arrogance in digital form. He plugged in a small drive and watched the progress bar crawl. Names, manifests, dates, payments, a trail of money dressed up as cargo. He clicked through folders until he saw a list marked by terminal numbers and container IDs, then a second file with phone numbers, initials, and a note that read, in plain text, "Quiet route." His jaw tightened. If he got this out, it wasn't just proof, it was leverage against a man who thought he owned the town. Boots clanged on the metal stairs, voices, close. "I left my phone," a man said, irritated, and Ethan recognized Colt Crane's spoiled bite. "Just unlock it, Vince." The handle rattled. Ethan yanked the drive free and palmed it hard enough to feel its edges. No back exit. The skylight was too high for a clean jump. He scanned, filing cabinets, a rolling chair, a narrow window. The lock clicked. Colt stepped in, damp shoulders, pistol in hand, sleek and practical now. And behind him, a thick bodyguard filled the doorway like a wall. Colt's eyes swept the room, landed on the open laptop, and his face changed like a switch flipping. "Somebody's been in here," he said, voice suddenly thin. Ethan moved first. He exploded from behind the cabinets, shoulder-checking the bodyguard into Colt. The pistol barked once, thunder inside a tin can, the round punching through a wall chart. Ethan shoved the rolling chair into Colt's legs, bought half a second, and dove for the window. Glass burst outward. Cold air slapped his face as he hit wet gravel and rolled. "He's here!" Colt screamed, and alarms erupted. Spotlights snapped on, slicing fog into bright knives. Ranger launched from beneath the trailer, body low, nails scritching on concrete, and met Ethan running. They climbed into the maze. Ethan hauled himself onto a red container. Ranger followed, paws scrabbling, finding purchase with stubborn precision despite wrapped ribs. Below, guards shouted. Boots clanged on ladders, flashlights jittered, and bullets sparked off metal, bright, meaningless fireworks in the rain. A gap opened ahead, 15 feet of air to the warehouse roof. Ethan ran and jumped, catching the edge with both hands, ribs slamming hard enough to steal breath. Ranger leaped after him, slipped for a terrifying second, and Ethan caught the harness and hauled, muscles burning, until the dog's paws scraped over the lip and they both rolled onto the roof. Ethan didn't let himself look down. He moved them along the dark side of the building, then down a ladder behind stacked pallets, back into streets that smelled like cedar and fried onions from an all-night diner. A neon sign buzzed somewhere in the distance. A pickup hissed past on wet pavement. Ethan kept moving anyway, the drive burning in his pocket like a live ember. In a warm office with a view of harbor lights, Silas Crane stood in silence while Colt paced, fury making him clumsy. "He stole files," Colt spat. "He moves like a ghost." Silas didn't look at him. On the desk lay a thin folder of photos. Megan unlocking her clinic door, Megan carrying dog food, Megan laughing with a child at the Saturday market. Silas traced one image with a slow finger, eyes flat. "You tried to fight a soldier on his terms," he said softly. "That was your mistake." Colt swallowed. "So what do we do?" Silas closed the folder with careful hands. "We don't chase the soldier," he said. "We make him chase us." His gaze lifted to the rain-striped window, to the harbor lights blinking like patient eyes. "We take what he will come back for. And when he comes, I want the dog alive, hurting, limping, so the soldier knows we can spare mercy or take it away again tonight." The driver's door of Megan Hart's Subaru gaped open in the rain, and a carton of milk lay smashed on the asphalt, spilling a white puddle under the orange street lamp, while Ranger's ears twitched once in the grass, and Ethan felt the cold rage arrive so cleanly it scared him. He'd known at 6:12 p.m., the moment the clinic clock clicked past the hour, because Megan never ran late without texting a quick apology and a joke about small-town traffic. She'd left with a list: gauze, dog food, a bag of ice for Ranger's bruised ribs, and a promise to be back before the kettle boiled. When 7:00 came and went, the reinforced front door stopped feeling like a shield and started feeling like a trap. Ethan paced past donation jars and lost pet flyers, calling Megan until the rings died, then calling again. Ranger, sedated in the recovery kennel, lifted his head at every pause like he could hear the empty space where her footsteps should have been. Ethan didn't take the clinic's old pickup. He cut downhill on foot, hood up, breath burning at 39 degrees. Shoes slapping wet pavement in a rhythm that matched his pulse. Porch lights glowed behind curtains. A flag on a neighbor's porch snapped in the wind, and the smell of diner coffee drifted from the highway, like a cruel comfort. The town looked normal in that way that made your skin crawl, as if it had decided not to notice what was happening. A pickup rumbled past, wipers squeaking, and the driver didn't look at Ethan's face. A porch swing creaked in the wind. Someone's TV glowed blue through a front window, loud enough to leak laughter into the wet night. He found the Subaru 3 blocks from the grocery store near an underpass where concrete collected mist and swallowed sound. The interior dome light was on. Megan's tote bag sat on the passenger seat, zipper torn. A grocery receipt fluttered on the floorboard. The keys dangled from the ignition like someone had yanked them and failed. On the ground beside the open door, a paper bag had ripped open, apples rolling toward the curb, a can of soup dented, the pumpkin pie box crushed like a punchline. Ranger lay half in the grass beside the shoulder, bandage around his ribs soaked through with rain. Blood matted the fur behind one ear, where someone had struck him, not to kill, but to drop him. Ethan dropped to his knees and went to work with the calm of a combat medic. "Ranger," he whispered, fingers finding warmth, then the tacky patch behind the ear. The dog's breathing was steady, shallow, stubborn. Then Ethan pulled a trauma dressing from his jacket pocket. He never went anywhere without one, and pressed it to the wound, steady pressure, counting seconds instead of feelings. Ranger's eyes fluttered open, glassy, then sharpened when he found Ethan. He tried to lift his head, failed, and a thin bark cracked into a whine. Ethan lifted the 85-pound German shepherd into his arms. Ranger groaned but didn't fight. He curled close the way he used to curl against Megan's legs under her desk, the way he anchored her when the world got loud. Rain soaked Ethan's hoodie. The street lamp cast their shadows long and warped on the wet road. A man carrying a wounded dog through a town that still pretended to be safe. Back at the clinic, Ethan cleaned the cut, wrapped Ranger's head, set an IV, and tucked him into the recovery kennel with a blanket and his worn tennis ball. Then he checked every lock again, every hinge, every blind, until the building felt like a held breath. He kept his voice low the way Megan did with scared animals, and he hated that he was borrowing her gentleness like a tool. Megan's ringtone sang from inside her jacket pocket on the hook behind the door. Ethan's head snapped up. The screen glowed with a video call from an unknown number. He answered, and Silas Crane filled the screen, calm in a warm office. "Mr. Brooks?" he said, as if they were old acquaintances. Silas turned the camera. Megan sat bound to a metal chair, duct tape across her mouth, eyes wide but furious. A man stood behind her with a baton in his hand. Ethan's voice came out flat. "If you touch her again, there is nowhere you can hide." Silas smiled without warmth. "You took something from my family. I took something from you. The exchange is simple." He named the old smelting foundry on the east side and gave Ethan 1 hour. Come alone, no police. No FBI. If I see a badge, Dr. Hart dies. Ethan forced the words through clenched teeth. "I'll be there." The screen went dark. Megan's gaze flicked once, sharp, and Ethan caught a tiny shake of her head, a warning he couldn't decode. Silas let the camera linger on the duct tape like it was a signature. "You're good at saving things," he said softly. "Let's see if you can save her." Ethan pictured the last time Megan laughed, wiping flour from her hands after insisting he take the first slice of pie, and the memory hit like a punch. Silas's tone stayed pleasant as he explained the rules again, as if politeness could make cruelty respectable. 1 hour, Ethan. Then I stopped being patient. Ethan stood in the quiet clinic with the phone dead in his hand while rain drummed the windows like impatient fingers. He went to the back storage room, lifted a loose floorboard, and pulled out the duffel he'd sworn he wouldn't open again. The oilcloth smelled like gun solvent and memory. Inside lay a tactical vest, zip ties, a breaching bar, a flashlight with a red filter, and one flashbang. He slid the vest on and felt something shift from rage to purpose. This wasn't a trade. This was a rescue. He left the flashbang in its pouch for a long beat, staring at it like it was a line he might cross and never come back from. Ethan took a paper cup, poured the cold diner coffee, and drank it anyway, letting bitterness steady his hands. A soft click made him turn. The kennel door was unlatched. Ranger stood there, swaying, head wrapped bright against black and tan fur, ribs bandaged, eyes clear. Ethan whispered, "Stay." Ranger didn't move. He stepped forward and pressed his flank to Ethan's leg, a warm, stubborn anchor, and released a low rumble that was not aggression, but vow. Ethan looked down, and in those amber eyes he saw the same demand he'd seen in teammates before a jump. "Don't leave me behind." Ethan exhaled hard. "Okay," he said. He clipped the leash on, opened the door, and the two of them stepped into the rain and headed for the foundry, 1 hour ticking down like a fuse. The courthouse feed on the clinic's tiny television snapped on at 6:03 a.m., and the anchor's voice cut through bleach, wet fur, and scorched insulation like a siren that finally meant help. "Breaking news out of Clatsop County," she said, bright lipstick and brighter urgency, while a banner crawled beneath her chin. "Port power broker in federal custody." Megan Hart froze behind the reception desk with a mop in her hands, staring at the screen until the wooden handle creaked under her grip. The video was shaky, filmed in rain and flashing lights, but she knew that broad-shouldered silhouette in the orange slicker being guided up courthouse steps. Silas Crane didn't look powerful now. He looked soaked, smaller, and furious in a way that couldn't change what was happening. A second banner popped up, multiple arrests. A third, sealed indictment unsealed today. Megan's throat tightened so hard she could taste copper. Behind her, the clinic smelled like a place that had survived an attack and was still pretending it was just a normal Tuesday. Ethan Brooks didn't move from the front window. His forearms stayed crossed, his gaze cutting the street into lanes. Pickup, sedan, delivery van, pedestrian, empty. Paper didn't stop bullets, and news didn't lock doors. He only loosened his stance when Ranger lifted his head from the blanket in the recovery kennel, blinked at the television's noise, and thumped his tail once, slow and certain. Megan stepped to the kennel and slid her fingers through the bars. Ranger pressed his muzzle into her palm, warm and heavy, and she let herself breathe with him. Ethan's eyes flicked over, and for a split second the hard line of his jaw softened. "It's real," Megan whispered. "They've got him." Ethan didn't smile. He nodded once, like a man accepting orders, and kept watching the street anyway. By mid-morning, the rain thinned to mist, and the harbor looked almost gentle, gulls gliding above stacks of steel like scraps of paper on a breeze. The clinic was still bruised, plywood over the side window, water stains on the wall, fresh screw heads shining on the reinforced doorframe, but people kept showing up anyway. Mrs. Alvarez from the diner arrived with a tray of black coffee and biscuits so warm the paper steamed. "Eat," she ordered, pushing a cup into Megan's hands like it was medicine. A retired Coast Guard chief named Donnelly brought a toolbox and replaced the front latch, whistling low like he was fixing a porch swing, not a trauma. Someone else dropped off a box of screws, another person left a roll of heavy plastic sheeting, and a kid in a hoodie quietly set a brand new porch light on the counter with a receipt taped to the box. Megan tried to say thank you a dozen times, and every time her voice cracked. Ranger watched each newcomer with calm, appraising eyes, then settled again, the tip of his tail tapping once against the blanket, as if he approved of the town deciding to be a shield. After lunch, Marcus Cole returned in a damp windbreaker with FBI in yellow block letters and the tired look of a man who measured his life in case numbers. He handed Megan a folder stamped with seals and signatures. "Protective order," he said. "Witness support. A direct line to my office if anyone with the Crane name tries to breathe near you again." Then he looked at Ethan. "And you?" Ethan's jaw flexed. "I didn't do this for paperwork," he said. Marcus's mouth twitched without becoming a smile. "Nobody does. But paperwork keeps you alive after the adrenaline wears off." Marcus flipped a page in the folder and pointed to a list. "The animals are being transferred today. A coastal raptor center is taking the birds. Oregon Wildlife Rehab is taking the seals that were still alive. Your records helped." Megan stared at the words, seeing more than ink. She saw a wire crate in the dark. She saw a sea lion's dull eye. She saw Ethan's hands shaking with rage as he held a bolt cutter. Marcus lowered his voice. "We also picked up Colt Crane and Deputy Rourke." Megan's mop slipped in her hands and thunked against the desk. Ethan's eyes hardened, the way they did when something inside him clicked into a fight. Marcus met that look and didn't flinch. "It's done," he said. "The net's up. The port's being audited. Federal oversight. It won't be perfect, but it won't be theirs." For once they breathed. On Thanksgiving morning, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks, and the air sat at 45 degrees like a clean sheet pulled tight. Mrs. Alvarez opened the diner early, neon crab sign humming, and she reserved the back booth without being asked. Megan walked in with Ranger on a leash, his coat brushed until it shone, bandages gone, leaving only a small patch of shaved fur behind his ear. Heads turned, then turned away with gentle respect, the way small towns pretend not to stare, while still making sure you feel seen. Ethan followed with a paper bag of oranges and a cheap bouquet of grocery store flowers that looked ridiculous in his big hands. He slid into the booth beside Megan and nudged a warm mug toward her. "Diner coffee," he said. "The real kind." The waitress refilled it without asking, the pot clinking against the rim like a tiny bell of reassurance. When the plates arrived, turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce in a little cup, Ranger lay under the table with his head on Megan's boot like he belonged there. Megan took one bite and realized she wasn't tasting food first. She was tasting safety. After they ate, Ethan drove Megan back up the hill in the borrowed pickup, heater rattling, windshield wipers squeaking, the town bright in a rare slice of sun. At the clinic, he carried a box of donated supplies inside, then stopped in the doorway as if he needed to memorize the site, the new porch light in its packaging, the reinforced lock, the donation jar with a few crumpled bills, Ranger's tennis ball by the kennel, Megan's coat. Hanging on the hook, "My flight's in 2 hours," he said, voice flat like he was trying not to let it matter. Megan felt the old panic rise, distance, silence, the way fear grew in empty rooms, but she didn't feed it. She stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar along Ethan's knuckle, close enough to smell cold air and soap on his jacket. 6 months, she said, making it a measurement instead of a tragedy. "Ah," Ethan nodded, then reached into his pocket and pressed a small brass key into her palm. "Storage unit," he said. "Spare gear, radio, cash. If anything feels wrong, you don't wait for permission." Megan closed her fingers around it, not because she wanted to need it, but because she understood the gift for what it really was. "I'm taking you seriously." At the airport curb, the air smelled of exhaust and wet pine. Ethan set his sea bag on the concrete and knelt in front of Ranger. "Hold the line," he whispered, thumb rubbing the spot behind Ranger's ears. Ranger licked his face once, slow and solemn, then pressed his forehead against Ethan's like a vow. Megan stood close enough to feel Ethan's warmth through his jacket. He kissed her forehead, brief but steady, the kind of tenderness that didn't ask permission. "I'm coming back," he said. Megan didn't make a speech. She nodded because she'd learned the hard way that promises didn't need poetry. They needed follow-through. Ethan looked down at her hand, at the key she still held, and his mouth lifted just slightly. "Good," he murmured. "Because you're not doing this alone." When he finally walked toward the sliding doors, Megan watched until he disappeared into the crowd, then turned back toward the parking lot with Ranger at her side. The pickup's engine coughed to life. The sky was pale and clean. And when they pulled into the clinic lot, the new porch light waited in its box like a small sun, ready to be screwed in and switched on, something bright that belonged to them, and wasn't going anywhere,